Jericho. The true story behind the fallen walls. The fall of the walls of Jericho is remembered as one of the most impressive victories in biblical history, but there's a question that's almost never asked. What if that battle hadn't been a victory? What if Joshua, instead of triumphing, had failed at the most crucial moment of the conquest? Ancient accounts, strategic silences, and subsequent decisions raise an uncomfortable possibility. Some details of the narrative seem adjusted, others are simply ignored. What if the story of Jericho wasn't written to record a military triumph, but to correct a defeat transformed into a symbol? What really happened there completely changes the interpretation of this conquest. The Battle of Jericho is often presented as the definitive beginning of the conquest of the Promised Land. A fortified city, imposing walls, and an unusual method of attack culminating in absolute victory. This version has become established as a symbol of obedience, faith, and triumph. However, when the episode is analyzed more closely, questions arise that are rarely explored. The account is brief, direct, and carefully structured to highlight the outcome, but offers few details about the confrontation itself. There is no description of organized resistance, defensive strategies, or immediate political consequences. The victory seems complete, but at the same time isolated. This raises the hypothesis that the narrative was constructed more to establish authority and continuity of the conquest project than to faithfully record a military event. The introduction of the Jericho story functions as a symbolic landmark, legitimizing Joshua's leadership and the transition after Moses. But, observing what happens afterward, it becomes clear that the conquest does not advance with the same expected force. This contrast opens up space for an alternative interpretation. Perhaps Jericho was not the decisive triumph it is usually portrayed as, but an episode reinterpreted to support a larger narrative. The environment surrounding Jericho helps explain why this battle gained such significant symbolic weight. The city was known as a strategic point, located in a fertile region and surrounded by important routes. At the same time, the surrounding territory presented logistical challenges, demanding organization, supply, and continuous control. The scenario did not favor improvised actions or isolated victories. The presence of a fortified city at the very beginning of the campaign created narrative pressure. A significant event was needed to justify entry and permanence in the territory. In this context, Jericho becomes more than just a military target. It comes to represent the validation of the conquest project as a whole. The environment reinforces this interpretation. As a victory, there would have a greater psychological impact than gradual advances in less visible areas. However, this same scenario also makes the silence about what came after seem strange. If the environment was so favorable to expansion after the fall of Jericho, why doesn't the narrative emphasize a clear sequence of immediate conquests? This gap suggests that Jericho's role may have been more symbolic than strategic. The first warning sign appears when the narrative quickly shifts from triumph to hardship. Immediately after Jericho, the expectation is for continuous progress, but the text records unexpected obstacles. The confidence built by the supposed victory does not translate into immediate territorial dominance. Instead, failures, adjustments, and moral explanations emerge for results that do not match the promised impact. This discrepancy is striking. If Jericho had been a clear and decisive victory, the psychological and strategic effect should have facilitated the following stages. However, the story does not follow this pattern. The warning sign is not an explicit defeat, but the constant need to justify slow progress. The narrative begins to shift the focus from the battlefield to the internal behavior of the people, as if the problem were not in the strategy or the actual outcome of the conquest, but in moral factors that need to be corrected. This shift suggests that something did not fall into place as expected immediately after Jericho, indicating that the event may not have been as conclusive as tradition claims. The witness to this moment emerges not as an explicit narrator, but as an implicit perspective within the narrative itself. It manifests itself in the form of contrasts, in the details that remain on the margins of the main account. While the official story presents obedience and victory, This silent witness appears in the contradictory results that follow the event. There is an attentive gaze that perceives the distance between what was proclaimed and what was actually consolidated in the territory. This witness observes that Joshua's authority needs to be constantly reaffirmed after Jericho, as if the episode had not been sufficient to guarantee uncontested leadership. They also perceive that fear and caution do not disappear, despite the supposed demonstration of power. This point of view does not directly confront the official version, but weakens it through the repetition of indirect signs. The witness in this case does not denounce an open defeat, but reveals a victory that did not produce the expected effects, suggesting that something in that confrontation was interpreted more favorably than the facts would allow. The initial investigation appears as an attempt to reorganize the meaning of events after Jericho. Faced with inconsistent results, the narrative begins to seek internal explanations to justify why the advance does not occur as expected. The focus shifts to individual failures, specific transgressions, and the need for moral purification. This investigation does not analyze the confrontation itself, but the group's behavior before and after it. In doing so, the story preserves the image of victory while transferring responsibility for subsequent obstacles. The Battle of Jericho remains untouched as a symbol, while the problems are explained as specific deviations that need to be corrected. This movement is significant because it reveals an effort to maintain the main narrative. Instead of questioning the actual success of the initial conquest, the inner workings of the community are investigated. Thus, the investigation functions less as a search for factual truth and more as a mechanism for narrative adjustment, ensuring that the leadership and the Conquest project remain legitimate, even in the face of evidence that the campaign did not develop as expected. The mysterious object emerges as a central element of continuity and authority in the Jericho narrative. It is not presented merely as part of the ritual, but as visible confirmation that the action was legitimized. Its presence shifts attention from the concrete outcome to the symbolic meaning of the event. Instead of evaluating the battle's effectiveness in strategic terms, the narrative emphasizes the fulfillment of instructions associated with this object. This creates a layer of interpretation where success does not depend on the immediate military effect, but on fidelity to procedure. The object then functions as a guarantee that the event should be remembered as a victory, regardless of the practical consequences. This dynamic allows the episode to be preserved as a founding landmark, even if its real effects are limited. Thus, the mysterious object not only participates in history, but helps to establish a specific version of events, supporting the official narrative in the face of subsequent results that do not confirm decisive dominance. If this interpretation is making you rethink this story, leave a comment below with your perspective. These videos are meant to provoke reflection, and I read all the comments. And if this type of content interests you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Silence begins to form soon after the Jericho episode, especially regarding details that could better clarify the confrontation. The narrative does not dwell on lengthy descriptions of the siege, nor on the reactions of the local population after the supposed fall of the city. This silence is not accidental. It creates a space where natural questions are left unexplored. By avoiding these details, the account maintains its focus on the symbolism of the event and reduces the possibility of questioning its real effectiveness. The silence also manifests itself in the rapid transition to new challenges, as if there were no time to fully assess the impact of the victory. This lack of depth functions as a narrative strategy, preserving the image of success while limiting the exposure of possible weaknesses. What is not said becomes as relevant as what is narrated, suggesting that the story of Jericho was deliberately concluded briefly to avoid contradictions with the events that followed. The twist becomes apparent when one observes that, despite the prominence given to Jericho, effective control of the territory is not established immediately. The proclaimed victory does not generate the expected transformation in the political or military landscape. Instead of continuous progress, the narrative needs to resort to new episodes to reaffirm authority and justify the continuation of the campaign. The twist lies not in a declared failure, but in the realization that Jericho did not fulfill the strategic role assigned to it. The episode functions more as a symbolic turning point than as a real watershed moment. This suggests that the story was reorganized to present a strong beginning, even if the reality on the ground was more complex. The twist, therefore, lies in the difference between the narrative impact and the practical effect, revealing that Jericho's triumph may have been less decisive than tradition usually asserts. What Jericho left behind was not just physical ruin, but an echo that reverberates through subsequent narratives. Each new episode of Conquest seems to carry a shadow of that first battle, as if the accounts constantly need to reaffirm something that was never fully achieved. This echo manifests itself in the repetitive patterns of the story: announced victories, unexpected obstacles, moral explanations, internal adjustments. It is a cycle that keeps the memory of Jericho alive, but also highlights the fragility of its concrete impact. The echo reveals a curious detail. The city of Jericho becomes a constant reference point, not for what it actually produced, but for what it should have produced. Each mention reinforces Joshua's authority and the legitimacy of the Conquest project, even if the facts on the ground suggest uncertainty. The symbol surpasses reality, and the narrative is shaped to echo the idea of triumph, where reality is more ambiguous. This effect is silent, but powerful. Those who read or listen to the story perceive the importance of the city, but rarely question whether that importance corresponds to the practical outcome of the battle. The stories that follow Jericho seem to revolve around this echo. They carry lessons, warnings, and examples of faithfulness, as if victory were a rule to be followed, regardless of its actual occurrence. The city, therefore, leaves a legacy that transcends the territory. It creates a narrative structure capable of justifying future efforts, explaining difficulties, and consolidating leadership. Each subsequent episode is a reflection of this echo, an attempt to maintain coherence with the image of initial success, even when reality insists on challenging that image. And it is in this echo that an inevitable reflection arises. The triumph of Jericho, if there was one, is not only in the stones that fell or the walls that opened. It lies in the way the story was told, in the care with which the symbol was preserved, in the power to create meaning from events that may not have been so clear. The echo is proof that the narrative can be more influential than the events themselves, shaping perceptions, beliefs, and expectations for generations that never witnessed what really happened. Meanwhile, the silence continues, filling gaps and reinforcing the official version. Every omitted detail is an invitation to speculation. Every rapid transition between events a reminder that not everything has been recorded or explained. The echo of Jericho is not merely a repetition, but a structure that allows the story to continue living, even when the concrete outcome remains undefined. So what do we learn from Jericho? Perhaps the greatest lesson lies not in the fallen walls, nor in the proclaimed victory, but in the power of storytelling. History shows that the way we recount events can be as influential as the actual events themselves. Triumph, when well told, can inspire, legitimize leaders, and consolidate projects, even if the reality was more complex or less decisive. Jericho leaves a mark that goes beyond the territory. It teaches us about interpretation, memory, and authority. The episode reveals that stories serve not only to record facts, but also to construct meaning, direct behavior, and justify choices. Every silence, every omitted detail, every selective emphasis is part of a strategy for preserving the symbol, which often overrides the actual effectiveness of the action. What if, in the end, the true conquest of Jericho was precisely that? Transforming a battle into a symbol, an episode into a lesson, a triumph into collective memory. What mattered was not the immediate control of the territory, but the ability to create a narrative that would shape generations and consolidate Joshua's leadership. Victory, in this sense, is not merely military, it is historical, cultural, and psychological. Reflecting on Jericho invites us to question not only past events, but also how we understand stories, victories, and defeats. How often do we accept apparent triumphs without realizing that the real impact may have been different? How often do symbols influence us more than clothing? If this perspective has changed how you see history, share your opinion in the comments. Like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos that investigate historical facts, mysteries, and interpretations that go beyond what the books tell us. Because in the end, Jericho teaches us something essential. What appears to be victory is not always what it truly was, and what we don't see is not always powerless. Silence, echo, and symbolism can be as powerful as any fallen wall. Jericho continues to speak to us, even through the silence of the stones and the gaps in the narrative. What has become most relevant is not the conquered territory, but the idea that the city carries. That victories can be built in the collective imagination, regardless of the practical outcome. Each wall that fell is a reminder that the power of a story can overcome the strength of an army. The weight of the symbol is revealed in every decision made after Jericho. When leaders or the people themselves face new challenges, the memory of the city serves as a guide, a justification, or a warning. It is a constant reference that shapes behavior and expectations, even if real control of the territory remains uncertain. This weight explains why the account remains so concise. The fewer details, the greater the power of the symbol, because there is no room for questioning the real effects of the battle. The symbol of Jericho also highlights something fundamental about human history and narrative. What we record, emphasize, and transmit influences more than what actually happens. The city is not just a geographical landmark. It becomes a lens through which we evaluate leadership, faith, and strategy. And this lens is powerful. It shapes perception, reinforces authority, and transforms any ambiguous outcome into a clear lesson. In the end, Jericho shows us that the power of a victory may reside more in memory and interpretation than in execution or immediate results. The city, the silence, the mysterious object, the carefully constructed narrative, all of this creates an invisible force that perpetuates itself far beyond the siege. History teaches us that symbols can sustain empires, reinforce leadership, and inspire generations, even when the facts behind them are uncertain or questionable. And as we reflect on Jericho, we realize that every story carries this potential. Each carefully crafted narrative can become more powerful than reality itself, reminding us to look with attention and curiosity at what is told and at what remains silent. In the end, Jericho is not just a city that fell, but a legacy that remains invisible, shaping perception and memory. The battle, the walls, the instruments, and the rituals have become symbols more powerful than the military conquest itself. The city serves as a reminder that what becomes history is not always what actually happened, but what needs to be remembered. The legacy of Jericho challenges us to look beyond the surface. It invites us to question established narratives, to perceive gaps and silences, and to understand that symbols can sustain societies, leadership, and beliefs far beyond physical strength or the immediate outcome of a battle. Every omitted detail, every strategic emphasis, every echo that resonates across generations reveals the power of a carefully crafted story. This reflection goes beyond Jericho. It reminds us that our own interpretations and memories have power. The way we tell our stories, the symbols we choose to preserve, and the echoes we leave for the future can be as transformative as any concrete event. History teaches us that sometimes the most important victory lies not in what we conquer, but in what we manage to make unforgettable. If this analysis made you rethink the history of Jericho, leave your thoughts in the comments. Share, like, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss videos that explore historical mysteries, forgotten facts, and interpretations that challenge the official version of events. Because, in the end, Jericho shows us a universal truth. The power of a symbol can overcome the power of a wall, and what remains in the collective memory is often more real than what actually happened. And in the silence that follows Jericho, there is a lesson that resonates louder than any trumpet or collapsing wall. The story shows us that not everything needs to be explicit to be powerful. What is left unsaid, what remains in the subtext, often carries more meaning than what is narrated in detail. The silence of Jericho speaks of strategy, memory, and interpretation. It reminds us that narrative can become more influential than the fact itself, that perception shapes reality, and that symbols can perpetuate power, authority, and inspiration, far beyond the time or space where the events took place. Concluding the story of Jericho is not merely closing a chapter of the conquest, but opening space for reflection. What do we accept as truth? What do we remember as triumph? And above all, how do we interpret the symbols that shape our own history and culture? If this video sparked your curiosity, share your opinion in the comments. Like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell to explore more stories that challenge official versions, reveal hidden mysteries, and invite us to look beyond the obvious. If you enjoyed this approach and want to continue exploring stories that are almost never told this way, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And now, click on the video that's appearing on the screen. It directly complements what you just watched and may completely change the way you see this story. Because Jericho leaves us with something no wall could: the understanding that silence, symbolism, and well-constructed narratives can be more enduring and powerful than any physical victory. And that is the true legacy of the city that fell, but never stopped speaking.